So who doesn't love a good ghost story? And of course, ghost stories often seem to be synonymous with old theatres. Australia's oldest theatre that is still being used is the Theatre Royal in Hobart of Tasmania. And of course, if you ask any Tasmanian, they'll tell you the Theatre Royal has its own ghost, Fred. Now, the stories differ as to where Fred originally came from. Some say that it goes back to the very, very early days of Hobart Town, and that he was basically someone who'd gotten drunk in a pub and fell off the stage. Other stories have him as being an actor falling off the stage. But it seems to be agreed that the Theatre Royal has a ghost called Fred. There's various stories about Fred's existence, and it seems to be agreed that he's a somewhat harmless ghost. Probably the biggest story in relation to Fred goes back to 1984, which was the year that the Theatre Royal went up in flames. It was an absolutely disastrous fire that started off somewhere in the auditorium, and the amount of damage that occurred as a result of the fire was absolutely staggering. There were paintings in the main auditorium area on the ceiling which were absolutely destroyed. Okay, so you're probably going to discover over time that I have dogs, and my dogs are classic snorers. So, with this being a new channel, I've tried very hard to work the audio around their snoring, but I realise that it's going to take forever. So, you will hear dogs snoring in the background. I apologise for that. I think it's an inevitability that I can't really do much about. So, going back to the Theatre Royal and the disastrous fire of 1984, there were some pretty amazing paintings on the ceiling in the Theatre Royal. They were headshots of, I think it was different composers. I can't remember offhand. But they were first painted when the Theatre Royal was built back in the mid-1800s. They were pretty much irreplaceable. They were utterly destroyed in the fire. And while a local painter did create replicas, I will say that the replicas didn't even come close to the original artwork. So when the fire occurred in 1984, the entire auditorium was destroyed. The fire took pretty quickly, obviously being a pretty old theatre. At that point it was well over 100 years old, so the fire took off pretty fast. The thing is, and the thing that saved the theatre, is that for some unknown reason, the fire curtain came down and separated the auditorium from the stage and the backstage area. This is the only thing that saved the Theatre Royal. People believe that it was actually Fred the Ghost who brought the fire curtain down, because they have not been able to find any explanation for how that fire curtain could have come down when there was nobody in the theatre at the time, and there was nothing as far as evidence to show that there was any sort of failure that caused the fire curtain to come down. Basically, the fire took off, the fire was looking like destroying the theatre, and the fire curtain came down and saved the whole back half of the theatre. The stage, the dressing rooms, all the older areas. So, yeah, it is believed that it was Fred who saved the Theatre Royal. Now, there's plenty of stories out there about Fred the Ghost, people seeing Fred the Ghost. And the story is that he prefers the dress circle, or that he's been seen in the dress circle. But I had a really interesting experience when I was a really young child. Because I had ADHD, I wasn't a very coordinated child. So I guess for that reason, my mother decided that learning ballet might be a good thing for me. Perhaps help me to become a little bit more coordinated. I was hopeless at it, and I think I gave up when I was in about grade 3. But the ballet school that I went to had a yearly recital at the Theatre Royal. And of course, leading up to the recital, there's lots of rehearsals at the ballet school, and then there'd be like final rehearsals at the Theatre Royal. And you'd go there for your allocated class time and then be picked up and head home. My sister is 3 years older than me and had been doing ballet for several years before I started. So on a particular day, way back when, we both had rehearsals at the Theatre Royal for the ballet recital with our classes. And our rehearsals weren't back to back. So it was decided that we would both be dropped off at the same time and picked up at the same time. And there were other children who had siblings in different classes, so it wasn't unheard of. Anyway, I had been doing my little practice thing on the stage, and we'd finished, all my friends had headed off, and my sister's group was on the stage rehearsing. And me being ADHD, I was starting to get a little bit bored. So I thought I'd explore a bit, and I decided to go right up into what is called the gods, which is the very, very top level of the theatre. It's a really uncomfortable area. The seats are wooden, and it's really high up. So I thought I'd go and sit in the gods and watch my sister's group for a little while. So I went and I sat in the gods, and I sat in the front row of the gods where the rail was so I could look straight down on the stage. And I had this sense that there was someone else up there. And bearing in mind I was quite little at this time, so thought of being up there with someone else was just a little bit scary anyway. But I glanced back, and right up the back, there's like a room that is, must be used for lighting and sound and everything. So it's a room right up the back, and it's got glass windows that look out across the auditorium. And just near the doorway of that room, I could see a figure, but I actually couldn't really properly define the figure. It was kind of dark up there because, like I said, this was during a rehearsal. So there wasn't much lighting in the auditorium. It was during the day, and no one was supposed to be up in the gods, so none of the lighting up in the gods was turned on. So I could see this figure by the door to the back room, like the sound room at the very back of the gods. But I just couldn't discern anything about the figure. It was more like just a shape. So I hightailed it out of there as fast as I could. Straight across to the door, back down the steps, back down to the foyer, and back down to the main auditorium area where the other younger siblings were sitting and waiting for their older siblings who were rehearsing. And I didn't tell anyone about it for a number of years. It was probably 2 or 3 years later that I told one of my best friends about it. And she laughed at me. And she told me I was silly. So I never told anyone else again. Until quite recently, as an adult, I discussed it with my sister. And the story that she told me was that she remembers seeing me up there in the gods. And she remembers having a discussion with one of her friends who was in her same class, because she couldn't figure out who the man was that was up the back, right up against the back wall in the gods, up behind me. And for some reason, something about that had wigged her out enough that she never discussed it with me either. But when she told me that she'd seen, when I was up in the gods watching, and that there was a figure up in the back, up further up behind me, but they couldn't actually figure out who it was or what it was, it just made my blood run cold. So, personally, I believe I have had an encounter with Fred the Ghost. I don't think he was malevolent in any way. I think I was just a very, very young child. I would have probably only been 6 or 7. So naturally, it would have been a pretty scary experience.